Imagine you are standing in the middle of a supermarket. The fluorescent lights hum above you. Your cart slowly fills. A bag of rice here, a loaf of bread there, some chicken, a bottle of oil. You move through the aisles almost automatically because this is just what feeding a family looks like. This is the system. You work, you earn, you buy, you eat. Every week, the cycle begins again. Now imagine stepping outside that supermarket and walking into someone's backyard. Somewhere warm, somewhere green, somewhere the soil is red and the air smells like rain. And in the middle of that backyard stands a single tree. Not a field, not a farm, just one tree. And that tree, every single year, quietly drops enough food to feed your entire family. Bread, something close to meat, something that spreads like butter, without anyone planting a single seed, turning a single shovel of soil, or buying a single bag of fertilizer. You would probably think that sounds impossible, but it isn't. It existed. It still exists. And almost nobody talks about it. This is a story about a tree, but it is really a story about how we forgot something extraordinary, not because it broke, not because it failed, but because the world around it changed direction and left it standing there, quietly producing while everyone stopped looking. The tree is called breadfruit. It has been growing across tropical regions of the world for thousands of years. It is not a myth, not an ancient memory, not something that only existed before modern science improved everything. It is alive right now, growing in backyards and along roadsides across the Pacific Islands, parts of Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, producing hundreds of pounds of food every single year. And most people living outside those regions have never heard of it. That silence is the mystery worth investigating. Let's start with what this tree actually does, because the numbers alone are enough to stop you mid-sentence. A single mature breadfruit tree produces somewhere between 300 and 600 pounds of fruit every year. Not once. Every year. For decades. You plant it, it establishes its roots, and then it simply begins, season after season, filling the space around it with food. No replanting, no resetting, no starting over. Now think about what 300 to 600 pounds of food actually means for a family. Picture filling your kitchen with that much weight in groceries, stacked on the counter, on the floor, overflowing into the hallway. A single tree does that, quietly, reliably, without asking much in return. But here is where it gets genuinely strange, almost hard to believe until you see it with your own eyes. The same fruit, depending on how you prepare it, becomes something completely different on your plate. You roast it, and the inside turns soft and airy, warm and filling, something your hands and your memory recognize as bread. You slice it thin and fry it, and suddenly the texture shifts, becomes firm and golden and satisfying in a way that sits somewhere between roasted potatoes and meat. You boil it, mash it down into a smooth paste, and it spreads, it holds shape. It behaves like a rich dough or something close to butter. One tree, one fruit, three completely different things on your table. In most parts of the world, getting those three things, your carbohydrates, your protein substitute, your fat, means managing three separate supply chains, three separate crops, three separate cycles of planting and harvesting and buying. This tree collapses all of that into a single root system growing in your backyard. The people who understood this best were the Polynesian navigators, some of the greatest explorers in human history. Thousands of years ago, they crossed thousands of miles of open ocean in wooden canoes, reading the stars, following birds, navigating by the feel of waves beneath their feet. And when they sailed toward a new island, toward a new life in an unknown place, they brought breadfruit with them. Not as a snack for the journey, as a foundation for civilization. They carried root cuttings carefully wrapped and protected across vast stretches of open water, because they understood something that takes a moment to fully land. They were not just bringing food. They were installing a system. They were planting the future. Once that tree was in the ground, it would outlast them. It would feed their children and their children's children and generations beyond that. No one would need to replant it. No one would need to manage complicated cycles of soil preparation and seeding. The tree would simply stand there year after year and give. That is not farming in the way we understand farming today. That is something closer to architecture. You build it once, and then it shelters everyone who comes after you. And here is the part that should sit with you for a moment, the part that makes this more than just a story about a fruit. In the 18th century, when European explorers first arrived at the Pacific Islands, they were confused. They saw stable communities, well-fed people, children playing, plenty of food, and almost no visible agriculture. No fields being turned, no rows of crops stretching to the horizon, no obvious, recognizable system of farming. What they were looking at did not match what they expected agriculture to look like. So many of them simply did not see it. The food was there. The system was there. But because it looked like a forest, because it was woven into the landscape rather than extracted from it, it was invisible to eyes trained to see food only in rows. That moment of not seeing had consequences that ripple all the way to today. And understanding those consequences, understanding why a tree that produces 600 pounds of food a year quietly vanished from the center of the world's attention, is exactly where this story is going next. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not live in books. It lives in hands, in the angle of a grandfather's wrist as he plants something in the ground, in the way a grandmother smells a fruit to know exactly when it is ready, in the quiet, accumulated wisdom of generations who learn not by reading about a system, but by living inside one. This kind of knowledge is the most powerful kind, and it is also the most fragile, because unlike a book, it does not survive neglect. The moment a generation stops practicing it, stops passing it forward, it begins to fade. And once it is gone, it does not leave a visible gap. It simply becomes something people no longer think to ask about. The story of breadfruit is, at its heart, a story about this kind of knowledge, about what happens when a system that genuinely works gets slowly surrounded by a louder, faster, more visible system, until the quieter one disappears, not with a dramatic ending, but with a gradual forgetting. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the beginning. Not of the tree, but of the relationship between human beings and this tree, because that relationship was unlike almost anything else in the history of food. Picture the Pacific Ocean as it looked several thousand years ago. No satellites above it, no shipping lanes crossing it, no maps of its islands carefully drawn and stored in libraries. Just water, more water than most people today can genuinely imagine, stretching in every direction for thousands upon thousands of miles, and moving across that water in canoes built from wood and rope and ingenuity were the Polynesian people. They were navigators of a skill level that still astonishes researchers today. They read the stars the way you read a familiar street. They felt the direction of oceans swells through the hull of a boat the way you feel a change in wind on your face. They watched birds and clouds and the color of water and understood exactly where land was, even when it was still far beyond the horizon. These were not people stumbling accidentally from island to island. These were deliberate, brilliant, purposeful explorers, and when they decided to settle a new island, they prepared for it with extraordinary care. They brought animals. They brought plants. They brought the seeds and cuttings and roots of everything they would need to build a life somewhere completely new. And among everything they carried across those impossible distances, breadfruit was treated as essential, not optional, not one item among many, essential. Think about what that tells you. When you are in a canoe on the open ocean, space is not something you waste. Every item you carry has to earn its place. And generation after generation of Polynesian navigators decided, across thousands of years of accumulated experience, that breadfruit always earned its place, that wherever they were going, whatever island waited on the other side of the horizon, they needed this tree to come with them. That is not a casual decision. That is a civilization declaring, in the clearest possible way, this tree is a foundation. This tree is infrastructure. This tree is how we build something that lasts. And once the tree was planted, it proved them right, every single time. A breadfruit tree does not produce in its first year. It takes time to establish, to root deeply, to grow into its full capability. But here is the thing about time. The Polynesian settlers understood it differently than we tend to today. They were not building for the next quarter. They were not thinking in seasons. They were thinking in generations. They planted a tree knowing that its greatest gifts would come not to them, but to the people who came after them. That act, planting something you will not fully benefit from yourself for the sake of those who follow, is one of the most profound expressions of community that a human being can make. And breadfruit made that act practical, tangible, rooted literally in the earth. Once established, the trees were planted not in distant fields separate from daily life, but woven directly into the spaces where people lived, along pathways, near doorways, in the spaces between homes. The food system was not somewhere you went to work. It was the landscape you already lived inside. You did not commute to your food supply. Your food supply was the backdrop of your entire existence. This is such a different relationship to food than the one most of us have today that it almost requires a moment to fully absorb. Today, for the majority of people on Earth, food begins somewhere invisible. A farm you have never seen, managed by people you will never meet, processed in a facility you could not locate on a map, and arrives in your hands through a chain of steps so long and complex that no single person fully understands all of it. The distance between you and the origin of your food is, for most people alive today, essentially infinite. For the communities built around breadfruit, that distance was the width of a footpath. Now here is where the story deepens into something genuinely remarkable. Breadfruit trees were never planted alone. They were the centerpiece, the anchor, of something far more sophisticated than a simple garden or orchard. The Pacific Islander communities built what researchers today call agroforestry systems, though that clinical term barely captures what these places actually were. Imagine walking through one of these landscapes. At the very top, towering above everything else, the broad canopy of the breadfruit trees, filtering light, holding moisture in the air, creating shade that made the ground beneath them cooler and more hospitable. Beneath those trees, in the dappled light they created, grew other plants, taro, yams, bananas, each occupying its own layer of space, each contributing something different to the diet of the community. And at ground level, the soil itself, protected from direct sun, kept moist by the canopy above, enriched by falling leaves, remained alive and healthy without anyone needing to constantly work it or add nutrients to it. From a distance, this did not look like a farm. It looked like a forest, a lush, green, layered, living forest. And that was precisely the point. A farm in the conventional sense is something you impose on the landscape. You clear the trees, flatten the ground, arrange everything in rows that make sense to you, and then spend enormous energy fighting the landscape's natural tendency to return to something wilder. You are constantly pushing against nature, constantly resetting, constantly starting over. What these communities built was the opposite. They worked with the landscape, layering their food sources into it, allowing the forest logic to remain in place while quietly redirecting its productivity toward human needs. The result was something that looked natural because it largely was natural, and because of that, it was extraordinarily stable. If one crop had a difficult season, the others continued. If a storm damaged one layer of the system, the other layers buffered the loss. The diversity built directly into the design was also the system's greatest protection. There was no single point of failure. There was no one critical harvest window where everything could go wrong at once. Production was spread across species, across layers, across time, and the whole thing hummed along quietly, reliably, requiring far less labor than anyone looking at its output would think possible. European explorers arriving at these islands in the 18th century recorded their observations with a mixture of wonder and confusion. They saw communities that were well-fed, stable, and functioning, but they could not find the agriculture. Where were the fields? Where were the plowing animals? Where were the rows and the tools and the visible, recognizable effort that they associated with feeding a population? The food was clearly there. The people were clearly healthy. But the system producing all of it was invisible to their eyes because it looked like nature rather than work. One observer wrote of arriving in Tahiti and finding more food growing than the population could possibly consume, and yet seeing almost no one actively farming in any way he recognized. What he was seeing, without having the framework to understand it, was a system so well designed that it had become almost effortless. A system where the hard work had already been done by the people who planted the trees generations earlier. And what remained was simply the quiet, continuous reward of that foresight. That image, a landscape overflowing with food, produced by trees planted by people long gone, tended lightly by the living, and destined to keep producing for those not yet born, is one of the most beautiful things in the entire history of human ingenuity. And yet somehow the world moved away from it. The question of how that happened and what it cost is exactly where this story leads next. There is a moment in the history of almost every great forgotten thing where you can pinpoint, not exactly but close enough, the turn, the place where the road split, where one path was taken and another was left behind, where something that worked beautifully was not destroyed, not disproven, not defeated in any fair contest of ideas, but simply left standing while everything else moved in a different direction. For breadfruit, that moment has a name, a place, and a story attached to it. And like most turning points in history, it did not look like a turning point when it was happening. It looked like progress. To understand it fully, you have to understand what Europe was doing in the 18th century. Because what Europe was doing in the 18th century was building the modern world, or at least a particular version of the modern world. One built on trade, on expansion, on the movement of goods across oceans, on the idea that wealth meant controlling resources and that controlling resources meant scaling up production of everything that could be measured, sold, and shipped. This was the age of plantations, of sugar and cotton and tobacco growing in vast, brutal monocultures across the Caribbean and the Americas. And the people running those plantations had a problem. The problem was feeding the people they had enslaved to work those fields. Feeding a large captive workforce is expensive if you are importing food. It cuts into profit. And profit in the plantation economy was the only thing that mattered. So the plantation owners began looking for a solution, something cheap, productive, easy to grow in tropical climates, something that could produce enormous quantities of calories with minimal investment. Someone told them about breadfruit. The idea spread quickly through the drawing rooms and merchant clubs of Europe. A tree that grows in poor soil, survives drought, produces hundreds of pounds of food without replanting, and asks almost nothing in return? For the plantation economy, this sounded like a perfect solution to a logistical problem. Cheap calories delivered by nature, requiring almost no ongoing investment. In 1787, the British Royal Society formally recommended that breadfruit be transported from the Pacific Islands to the Caribbean. A ship was commissioned for the purpose. That ship was called the HMS Bounty, and the man put in charge of the mission was a naval officer named William Bligh. You may already know how that story ended. The crew of the Bounty mutinied. Fletcher Christian led the revolt. Bligh and a small group of loyal sailors were set adrift in a small open boat. And in one of the most extraordinary feats of navigation in history, Bligh sailed that small boat nearly 4,000 miles to safety, guiding it across open ocean with little more than a sextant in sheer determination. The breadfruit plants were thrown overboard during the mutiny. The mission failed. The story of the Bounty became one of the most famous tales of adventure and rebellion in naval history, told and retold in books and films for more than 2 centuries. But here is the part of that story that almost no one tells. Bligh went back. A few years later, William Bligh made a second voyage. He successfully transported breadfruit plants from the Pacific to the Caribbean. He completed the mission he had originally been sent to accomplish. The trees were planted, they grew, they produced exactly as promised, and the enslaved people of the Caribbean refused to eat them. That detail, that quiet, human detail, tends to get lost in the drama of the mutiny story. But it matters enormously because it reveals something about breadfruit that goes far beyond botany or agriculture or economic theory. Food is not just calories. Food is memory. Food is identity. Food is the specific smell of something your mother cooked, the texture of something that meant safety when you were a child, the flavor that connects you to a place and a people and a time. When you strip a person of their home, their family, their freedom, their name, and then hand them an unfamiliar fruit grown from a tree imported from a place they have never been, and tell them this is their food now, eat it, you are asking something that goes beyond hunger. The people of the Caribbean already had food cultures, food traditions, food knowledge of their own. Breadfruit, arriving in the context of plantation slavery, was not offered as a gift or a discovery. It was offered as a convenience, a cheap solution to a logistics problem. And people recognized that. They pushed back in the only way available to them. They simply would not eat it. Breadfruit did eventually become part of Caribbean cuisine, but slowly, gradually, on its own terms, integrated into local food cultures over generations in ways that reflected genuine adoption rather than forced consumption. Today it grows across the Caribbean and is loved there. But the original plan, to use it as a cheap feeding tool for an enslaved workforce, failed completely. And when it failed in that specific high-visibility context, something subtle happened to breadfruit's reputation in the European imagination. It had been promoted as a solution, and it had not delivered that solution. The story moved on. The interest cooled, and breadfruit was quietly filed away under the category of things that seemed promising but did not pan out, even though the failure had nothing to do with the tree and everything to do with the horrifying context in which it was introduced. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something quieter, slower, but ultimately far more consequential for the future of how humanity would grow its food. The Industrial Revolution was remaking the world. Factories were rising, cities were swelling with people who had left the countryside looking for wages. And feeding those cities, millions of people packed into urban spaces with no land of their own, no trees in their backyards, no ancestral knowledge of what to plant and when, required a completely different kind of food system than anything that had existed before. It required food that could be produced at enormous scale, in one place, processed into a standardized form, packaged, transported, and sold. It required food that behaved predictably, that could be measured in identical units, stored for consistent periods, and moved through systems of trade that operated on schedules and contracts and guarantees. In other words, it required food that was nothing like breadfruit. Wheat could be harvested all at once, threshed, milled into flour, and shipped in sacks anywhere in the world. Rice could be grown in flooded paddies, harvested in a single window, dried and stored for months. These crops fit the emerging logic of industrial food systems with almost perfect compatibility. They could be scaled, they could be standardized, they could be owned, traded, and controlled. Breadfruit could not. You cannot harvest a breadfruit tree all at once because the fruits ripen gradually, on their own schedule, across weeks and months. You cannot easily store raw breadfruit for long periods without processing it. You cannot run a mechanized harvester through a layered agroforestry system built around trees of different heights and ages. You cannot reduce the output of a perennial tree to identical, interchangeable units the way you can with grain. Every single quality that made breadfruit extraordinary as a food source for a family or a village, its gradual, continuous production, its integration into a living landscape, its resistance to total failure, made it essentially incompatible with the logic of industrial agriculture. This is the part of the story that sits heaviest if you let it. Because we are not talking about something that was evaluated honestly and found lacking. We are not talking about a fair competition between two systems where one proves superior. We are talking about a set of values: efficiency, scalability, standardization, profit, being applied to a system that was built around entirely different values: stability, sufficiency, integration, longevity, and the first set of values simply not being able to recognize what the second set had built. The industrial food system did not look at the breadfruit agroforestry systems of the Pacific and decide they were inferior. It looked at them and could not see them at all, because they did not fit the template. They did not produce in ways that could be bought and sold at scale. They did not create the kind of dependency on seeds, on inputs, on annual purchases that a commercial food system depends on to function. A tree that you plant once and that feeds your family for decades without requiring you to buy anything is, from the perspective of a commercial food supply chain, essentially useless. Not because it produces too little, it produces an extraordinary amount, but because it produces in a way that removes you from the market rather than keeping you inside it. And systems that remove people from markets do not get promoted, funded, researched, or distributed through the channels that shape what the world grows and eats. So breadfruit did not disappear overnight. It was not banned or burned or forgotten in a single dramatic moment. It simply became less and less central to the story that the modern world was telling itself about food. The research went elsewhere. The investment went elsewhere. The agricultural schools and the government programs and the international development funds all flowed toward crops that fit the industrial model, toward wheat and rice and maize and soybeans, toward annual crops that kept farmers buying seeds every year, toward systems that produced enormous volumes at specific moments and could be moved through centralized supply chains to urban populations around the world. And breadfruit stood still, in backyards, along roadsides, in the layered forest gardens of islands that the modern food system had decided were peripheral, still producing, still feeding the people closest to it, still doing exactly what it had always done, just no longer in anyone's plans. That quiet, stubborn persistence, a tree continuing to give, long after the world stopped paying attention, is perhaps the most important thing about this story, because it means the solution was never actually lost. It was only overlooked. And what happens when we finally look again? That is exactly where this story is heading next.